Before we begin, a quick note about how this episode was created. This episode uses AI-generated narration to bring Dr. Jackal's voice and character to life. However, the ideas, framing, and wording are my own. Dr. Alyssa R. Jones. The content has been synthesized, paraphrased, and adapted from history of psychology textbooks, scholarly work, lectures, professors, and other educational resources that have shaped my understanding of psychology, science, philosophy, and the mind. AI is used as a creative teaching tool, but the educational interpretation, organization, and teaching perspective come from me. Some wording may be condensed or adapted for clarity, accessibility, and narrative flow. This episode is designed to support learning, discussion, and historical engagement, and to invite students into the ideas, not replace the original sources. Welcome back to Dr. Jackal's History and Systems of Psychology podcast, where we trace the strange, brilliant, and occasionally messy road that made psychology into a science. I'm Dr. Jackal, your lab mascot guide through the schools, protests, methods, measurement tools, contradictions, and very opinionated psychologists who shape the field. Today, American psychology gets practical, developmental, and increasingly done with tiny mental atoms. In this episode, we are not just memorizing a timeline. We are tracking how psychologists changed what counted as evidence, what counted as science, and what counted as the mind in the first place. Last time, we talked about William James and the stream of consciousness. James helped move psychology away from the structuralist idea that the mind should be broken into elements and toward the functionalist idea that mental life should be understood in terms of what it does. Today, that functionalist spirit expands. Psychology becomes more applied, more developmental, more interested in education, more interested in individual lives, more willing to study children, women, behavior, adaptation, and real-world problems. And we begin with a very important historical problem: the sexist claim that women were naturally less capable than men. Spoiler, women psychologists did what psychologists do best. They collected data. Part 1. The variability hypothesis and the women who took it apart. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, women faced serious discrimination in education. One powerful example is Mary Whiton Calkins. Calkins completed all the requirements for a doctoral degree at Harvard. Her doctoral examination was reportedly described as one of the most brilliant PhD examinations ever given there. And yet Harvard refused to grant her the degree because she was a woman. That tells us something important about the history of psychology. Scientific fields are not shaped only by ideas. They are shaped by institutions, power, exclusion, and who is allowed to be recognized. At the time, many people believed that women's natural intellectual abilities were inferior to men's. This was not just a casual stereotype. It was treated by many scholars as if it were a scientific fact. The belief was that even if women were given educational opportunities similar to men, their supposed innate intellectual deficiencies would prevent them from truly benefiting from those opportunities. One idea used to support this claim was the variability hypothesis. The variability hypothesis was based partly on Darwinian ideas about male variability. Darwin had observed that in many species, males showed a wider range of physical characteristics and abilities than females. Female abilities, according to this view, were more clustered around the average. This idea was then applied to human intelligence in a highly biased way. People argued that men showed a greater range of talents, meaning men would appear at both the very low and very high ends of ability. Women, supposedly, were more average. That claim was then used to argue that women were less likely to benefit from higher education and less likely to achieve greatness in intellectual or scholarly work. From there, the argument became even more damaging. Some people claimed that female brains were less highly evolved than male brains. Men were seen as more adaptable, more variable, and more capable of benefiting from stimulating environments. Women were treated as inferior in the physical and mental functions needed to adapt successfully to environmental demands. This produced what we might call a theory of functional inequality between the sexes. And then came an even more disturbing claim. Some argued that higher education would physically and emotionally damage women. Many psychologists and physicians claimed that educating women would interfere with their biological purpose of motherhood, disrupt the menstrual cycle, weaken the maternal urge, and damage women's bodies. So women were not only excluded from higher education, their exclusion was defended as if it were for their own biological protection. That is the kind of historical claim that psychology needed to test instead of assume, and 2 women psychologists did exactly that. Part 2. Helen Bradford Thompson Woolley. One of the major figures who challenged these claims was Helen Bradford Thompson Woolley. In 1908, Woolley accepted a position with the Vocational Bureau of the public school system in Cincinnati, Ohio. Her work there was connected to child welfare. She conducted research on the effects of child labor, and that research contributed to changes in Ohio's child labor laws. She also served as president of the National Vocational Guidance Association. Later, she joined the staff of the Merrill Palmer Institute, where she worked in the nursery school program and studied child development and mental abilities. She eventually became director of the new Institute of Child Welfare Research at Columbia University, where she worked on learning in early childhood, vocational education, and school guidance counseling. Woolley's doctoral research was especially important because it directly tested the Darwinian claim that women were biologically inferior to men. That claim had often been treated as obvious, which meant many people had not actually bothered to test it. Woolley did. She administered a battery of tests to 25 male and 25 female participants. These tests measured motor abilities, sensory thresholds, intellectual abilities, and personality traits. Her findings challenged the assumptions of the time. She found no difference between the sexes in emotional functioning. She found only small, insignificant differences in intellectual ability. In some areas, women performed slightly better than men, especially in abilities such as memory and sensory perception. But Woolley did not interpret those differences as proof of female biological superiority. Instead, she attributed them to social and environmental factors, such as differences in child-rearing practices and expectations for boys and girls. That is important. Woolley was not simply reversing the bias. She was questioning the assumption that differences must be biological. She argued that social environment mattered, and for that, she was criticized. Many psychologists claimed her results were biased because she was a woman conducting research, showing that women were not biologically inferior. G. Stanley Hall accused her of giving the data a feminist interpretation, which is historically fascinating because the earlier claims of female inferiority were also interpretations. They were just interpretations that supported existing power. Woolley continued working as a teacher, researcher, and mentor to women psychologists in child development and education for more than 30 years. Her work helped show that claims about women's intellectual inferiority were not scientific truths. They were cultural assumptions waiting to be challenged. Part 3. Leta Stetter Hollingworth. Another major figure was Leta Stetter Hollingworth. Hollingworth studied at Columbia University with Edward L. Thorndike. Her husband accepted consulting jobs to help pay for her tuition, which gives us another glimpse into how difficult access to education could be for women. After earning her PhD, Hollingworth worked as a psychologist for the civil service in New York City. She also conducted extensive empirical research on the variability hypothesis. For a time, she focused on physical and sensory-motor functioning, as well as intellectual abilities across different groups. She studied infants, male and female college students, women during their menstrual periods. Her results contradicted the variability hypothesis and other claims about women's inferiority. She found that menstrual cycles were not related to performance deficits in perceptual skills, motor skills, or intellectual abilities. That directly challenged the idea that women were cognitively or physically impaired by normal reproductive physiology. Hollingworth also questioned the claim that women could find satisfaction only through childbearing. She challenged the idea of an innate instinct for motherhood. She rejected the belief that women who desired achievement outside marriage and family were abnormal or unhealthy. Instead, Hollingworth argued that social and cultural attitudes were much more influential than biology in keeping women from becoming full contributors to society. This is a crucial functionalist era point. Psychology was beginning to examine how people function in real environments, and those environments included sexism, educational barriers, cultural expectations, and institutional exclusion. Hollingworth also made major contributions to clinical, educational, and school psychology. She even helped popularize the term gifted children, so both Woolley and Hollingworth did more than challenge sexist claims. They expanded psychology's methods, subjects, and applications. They used empirical research to challenge biological determinism, and they showed that psychology could be used to test social assumptions rather than simply repeat them. Part 4. G. Stanley Hall and Developmental Psychology. Now we turn to Granville Stanley Hall, usually known as G. Stanley Hall. Hall is a major figure in American psychology. He is credited with founding the first psychology laboratory in the United States, as well as the first American Psychology Journal. He was the first president of Clark University. He helped organize the American Psychological Association and served as its first president. He was one of the first applied psychologists. He received the first doctoral degree in psychology in the United States, and he was one of the early American students connected to the first psychology laboratory. Hall became interested in psychology after reading Wundt's Physiological Psychology. He moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts, where he began graduate studies and conducted research at the medical school. He also worked with William James, who became one of his close friends. After earning his degree, Hall traveled to Leipzig and conducted research on physiological topics. When he returned to the United States, he did not immediately have job prospects, but Hall would eventually become a figure of national importance. He recognized that his goals fit strongly with the application of psychology to education. He gave a talk at the National Educational Association where he argued that the psychological study of children should become a major part of the teaching profession. He also delivered Saturday morning talks on education at Harvard and lectured part-time at Johns Hopkins University. Eventually, he was offered a professorship at Johns Hopkins. There, he established what is usually considered the first American psychology laboratory, which he called his Laboratory of Psychophysiology. Hall also founded the American Journal of Psychology, the first psychology journal in the United States. That journal became a platform for theoretical and experimental ideas and helped create a sense of solidarity and independence for American psychology. Later, Hall became the first president of Clark University, where he emphasized research more than teaching. He also established the journal Pedagogical Seminary, later known as the Journal of Genetic Psychology, to support research on child study and educational psychology. He founded the Journal of Applied Psychology as well. By that point, American psychology had become institutionally stronger. There were journals, laboratories, universities, professional organizations, applied research programs. Hall helped build that infrastructure. Part 5. Hall, Freud, Women and Minority Students. Hall also played an important role in introducing Freud to the United States. He was the first American psychologist to become deeply interested in Freudian psychoanalysis and was largely responsible for the attention Freud received in America. He invited Freud to Clark University in 1909, which became a major event in the history of psychoanalysis in the United States. Hall also made Clark University more receptive to women and minority students than many other American schools at the time. The first African American to earn a doctoral degree in psychology, Frances Cecil Sumner, did so under Hall. This is another example of the complexity of historical figures. Hall held many ideas that we would now criticize strongly, including views about sex differences and development. But he also created institutional pathways that expanded access for some students who were excluded elsewhere. History is rarely simple. Part 6. Hall and the Child Study Movement. Most of Hall's interests centered on evolutionary theory. He believed that the normal growth of the mind involved a series of evolutionary phases. Because of his concern with human and animal development and adaptation, he was sometimes called a genetic psychologist. Here, genetic does not mean genes in the modern DNA sense. It refers to development or genesis, how something comes into being over time. Hall's developmental interest led him to the psychological study of childhood. Childhood became the core of his psychology. He wanted to apply psychology to the functioning of children in the real world. Hall developed questionnaires and administered them across many topics. His work strongly influenced the child study movement. Now, the child study movement had serious methodological problems. Hall's subject samples were often inadequate. His questionnaires were not always sound. The people collecting data were often untrained. The data were poorly analyzed. So by modern standards, the methods were weak, but the movement still mattered. It helped generate the empirical study of children. It helped establish the idea of psychological development as an important topic. And it pushed psychology into schools, childhood, education, and everyday life. That is functionalism expanding the field. Part 7. Adolescence and Recapitulation Theory. Hall's most influential work was Adolescence, its psychology and its relations to physiology, anthropology, sociology, sex, crime, religion, and education. That title is almost an entire syllabus. This work helped inaugurate the scientific study of adolescent psychology. In it, Hall introduced his recapitulation theory of psychological development. Recapitulation theory claimed that children, in their personal development, repeat the life history of the human race. In Hall's view, development moves from a supposedly savage-like infancy and childhood toward rational, civilized adulthood. Today, this theory is not accepted. It reflects outdated evolutionary assumptions and deeply problematic cultural biases. But historically, it mattered because it tried to connect development, evolution, education, and psychology. The book was controversial, partly because of its intense focus on sex. Later in life, Hall became interested in the later stages of human development. He published Senescence, the first large-scale survey of psychological issues in old age. So Hall helped expand psychology across the lifespan. Childhood, adolescence, old age. That developmental scope was important for American psychology. Part 8. Dewey, Titchener, and the Naming of Functionalism. Now we return to functionalism as a broader movement. Functionalism was not originally intended to be a formal school of thought. The scholars associated with it were rebelling against Wundt's psychology and Titchener's structuralism, but they were not necessarily trying to create a new ism. They wanted to modify the existing orthodoxy, not completely replace it. Unlike structuralism, functionalism was never a rigid systematic position. There was not one single functional psychology. There were several functional psychologies, all sharing a general interest in studying the functions of consciousness. Functionalists were interested in applying psychology to everyday problems. They wanted to understand how people function in and adapt to different environments. This interest helped drive the rapid development of applied psychology in the United States. That may be the most important legacy of functionalism. And ironically, Titchener helped give functionalism its identity. Titchener opposed functionalism, but in doing so, he helped define it. In his article, The Postulates of a Structural Psychology, Titchener contrasted structural psychology with functional psychology. He argued for structuralism, but by naming the contrast, he gave functionalism status as an opponent. Sometimes your critic gives you your brand. Part 9. John Dewey and Progressive Education. One of the most important functionalists was John Dewey. Dewey earned his PhD from Johns Hopkins University and taught at several universities, including Michigan and Minnesota. He published a successful textbook called Psychology, which was widely used until William James's principles of psychology became dominant. Dewey was also a major figure in education. He established a laboratory school, which became a cornerstone of the progressive education movement. This reflected the functionalist commitment to applying psychology to real-world problems. Later, Dewey moved to Columbia University in New York, where he continued applying psychology to educational and philosophical issues. Dewey's work shows the practical orientation of many functional psychologists. They were not content to study consciousness in isolation. They wanted psychology to matter in classrooms, communities, institutions, and everyday life. Part 10. Dewey's Reflex Arc Concept. Dewey's article, The Reflex Arc Concept in Psychology, published in Psychological Review, was highly influential for functionalism. In this article, Dewey attacked the molecularism, elementism, and reductionism of the reflex arc. The traditional reflex arc idea separates behavior into stimulus and response. For example, a child sees a flame. The child pulls back their hand. Stimulus. Response. But Dewey argued that this was too simplistic. He suggested that the reflex is better understood as a circle rather than an arc. Why? Because the child's perception of the stimulus changes through action. When the child reaches toward the flame has one meaning. After the child feels heat or pain and withdraws, the flame has a different meaning. The response changes the perception of the stimulus. So perception and movement are not separate pieces. They function together as part of a coordinated act. Dewey argued that behavior cannot be meaningfully reduced into isolated elements any more than consciousness can. To do so is artificial. It causes behavior to lose meaning. Behavior should not be treated as an artificial scientific construct made of disconnected pieces. It should be studied in terms of its significance for the organism adapting to its environment. For Dewey, the subject matter of psychology should be the total organism functioning in its environment. Consciousness and behavior support the life of the organism. Consciousness helps bring about appropriate behavior that enables survival. So functional psychology studies the organism in use. That view was deeply influenced by evolutionary theory. Dewey did not think the structure and function of consciousness could be meaningfully separated. His significance lies in how he influenced psychologists, educators, and philosophers, and in how he helped provide the philosophical framework for functionalism. Part 11. Angel and Functionalist Themes. Another major functionalist was James Roland Angel. Angel believed functional psychology had been part of psychology from earlier times. In his view, structural psychology had set itself apart from an older and more pervasive functional form of psychology. Angel identified three major themes of functionalism. First, functional psychology is the psychology of mental operations. This contrasts with structuralism's focus on mental elements. Functionalism asks, how does a mental process operate? What does it accomplish? Under what conditions does it occur? This directly opposed structuralism. Second, functional psychology is the psychology of the fundamental utilities of consciousness. That means consciousness is understood in a utilitarian way. It mediates between the needs of the organism and the demands of the environment. If consciousness has survived, then it must perform an essential service for the organism. Functional psychologists wanted to discover exactly what that service was. They asked not only about consciousness in general, but also about more specific mental processes like judging and willing. What are they for? How do they help the organism adapt? Third, functional psychology is concerned with psychophysical relations, or mind-body relations. Functionalism studies the total relationship of the organism to its environment. This means it includes both mind and body. Functionalists did not draw a strict distinction between them. Mind and body were treated as belonging to the same order, with an easy transfer from one to the other. Angel gave an address to the APA at a time when the functionalist spirit was already widely accepted. His contribution was to shape that spirit into a more active enterprise. He helped give functionalism a laboratory, a body of research data, enthusiastic teachers, and a dedicated group of graduate students. Even though Angel did not necessarily think functionalism should become its own separate school, he helped guide it into becoming one. Part 12. Harvey Carr and Functionalism at its peak. Harvey A. Carr elaborated on Angel's theories. Carr's work represents functionalism after it no longer needed to crusade against structuralism. Functionalism had become mainstream. In fact, under Carr, functionalism reached its peak as a formal system. Carr maintained that functionalism was the American psychology. His textbook, Psychology, presented functionalism in its most refined form. Carr made two major points. First, he defined the subject matter of psychology as mental activity. Mental activities include processes such as memory, perception, feeling, imagination, judgment, and will. Second, he argued that the function of mental activity is to acquire, fixate, organize, and evaluate experiences, and then use those experiences to guide action. Carr called mental activities with a specific form of action adaptive or adjustive behavior. His functional psychology emphasized mental processes rather than elements and contents of consciousness. He described mental activity in terms of what it accomplishes in helping an organism adapt to its environment. And by this point, these ideas were no longer fringe. They had become accepted. Functionalism had become mainstream psychology in America. Part 13. Woodworth's Dynamic Psychology. Now we turn to Robert Sessions Woodworth. Woodworth did not like the constraints of belonging to a formal school of thought. So he was not officially a functionalist in the strict sense. But his work fits beautifully into this broader movement. Woodworth became interested in psychology after hearing a talk by G. Stanley Hall and reading William James's Principles of Psychology. After earning his doctoral degree, he described his view of psychology in journal articles and in books such as Dynamic Psychology and Dynamics of Behavior. He also wrote an introductory textbook called Psychology, which reportedly outsold every other psychology text of its time. His experimental psychology also became a classic textbook. Woodworth received the first gold medal award from the American Psychological Foundation for his contributions as an integrator and organizer of psychological knowledge. He believed his approach was not really new. In his view, it was simply the approach good psychologists had always followed, even before psychology became a formal science. Woodworth argued that psychologists must investigate the stimulus and the response, but that this alone is not enough. If psychologists focus only on stimulus and response, they miss what may be the most important part, the living organism itself. The stimulus is not the complete cause of a response. The organism helps determine the response, and the organism does so through its energy levels, current experiences, past experiences, motives, and internal conditions. This led Woodworth to propose a famous modification of stimulus-response thinking, SOR, stimulus, organism, response. That O matters. It represents the living organism between stimulus and response. Woodworth believed psychology must consider both consciousness and behavior. Objective observations of external stimuli and overt responses are important, but whatever occurs within the organism may require introspection. So Woodworth accepted introspection as one tool among others, alongside observational and experimental methods. Part 14, Motivation and Dynamic Psychology. Woodworth introduced dynamic psychology into functionalism. Dynamic psychology is related to motivation. Woodworth was so interested in motivation that he wanted to establish what he called a motivology, which is a delightfully awkward word. His primary interest was in the forces that drive or motivate human beings. He believed psychology's goal should be to determine why people behave as they do. Woodworth also emphasized the physiological events underlying behavior. His dynamic psychology focused on cause and effect relationships, but not in a simple mechanical way. He wanted to know how internal states, motivation, energy, and experience shaped behavior. In this way, Woodworth helped keep psychology from becoming too simple. Behavior is not just stimulus in, response out. The organism matters, motivation matters, the internal state matters. That idea would become very important as psychology moved toward behaviorism and eventually beyond it. Part 15, How Functionalism Expanded the Field. One of functionalism's most important and lasting contributions was the practical application of psychology to real-life problems. Functionalism helped expand psychology beyond the narrow study of adult consciousness in the laboratory. Research on animal behavior became a vital area of psychology. Psychologists began studying infants, children, and people with mental disabilities. The field became broader in both subject matter and method. Functionalists supplemented introspection with data from other methods. These included psychological research, mental tests, questionnaires, and objective descriptions of behavior. Applied psychology became especially prominent in the United States. Functionalists had no need to preserve psychology as a pure science of consciousness, and they did not apologize for their practical interests. That is a major difference from Titchener. Titchener wanted psychology to remain a pure science. Functionalists wanted psychology to work. They wanted it to be useful. They wanted it to matter in schools, workplaces, clinics, and society. That practical spirit became one of the defining features of American psychology. Part 16, Functionalism as a Bridge to Behaviorism. Functionalism also helped prepare the way for behaviorism. Titchener believed that psychology should focus on introspective analysis of the mind into elements. He argued that approaches deviating from this subject matter were not truly psychology. Functionalists challenged that definition. They argued that psychology could study more than conscious elements. It could study behavior, adaptation, development, applied problems, and mental activity in context. Functionalists such as Carr believed that both pure and applied psychology could follow rigorous scientific procedures. They also believed valid research could be done outside university laboratories, factories, offices, classrooms, clinics, schools. All of these could be legitimate places for psychological research. For functionalists, the scientific worth of psychology depended on method, not on a narrow subject matter. This is a huge shift. If method matters more than subject matter, then psychology can expand dramatically. In America, the culture valued the practical, the usable, and what worked. Instead of asking only, what is the mind? Psychologists increasingly asked, what does the mind do? That question carried psychology toward application. And eventually, some psychologists would go even further. They would ask whether psychology needed the mind at all. That is where behaviorism enters. Functionalism loosens psychology from the structuralist study of consciousness. Behaviorism would try to cut the tie completely. The big takeaway from today's episode is that psychology changed through argument, measurement, method, and cultural pressure. The names matter. Calkins matters. Woolley matters. Hollingworth matters. Hall matters. Dewey matters. Angel matters. Carr matters. Woodworth matters. But the pattern matters more. Each figure or school is responding to a problem left behind by the last one. Structuralism narrowed psychology to the elements of consciousness. Functionalism widened psychology to the study of mental activity, adaptation, development, behavior, and real-world application. Women psychologists challenged biological claims that were used to justify exclusion. Developmental psychologists made children and adolescents serious subjects of study. Educational psychologists brought psychology into schools. Functionalists argued that psychology should study the total organism functioning in its environment. And Woodworth reminded the field that between stimulus and response, there is a living organism. That is the road we are following. Psychology is becoming broader, more practical, more developmental, more applied, and more American. We'll close the archive here for now. Keep thinking historically, keep questioning scientifically, and remember, every theory has a backstory. This is Dr. Jackal, signing off.